that we're launching today, or towards an SDG movement map for Australia. And this work has a bit of a long history, which I won't go into too much here, but has been funded by the Centre for Policy Futures and the Centre for Digital Cultures and Societies here at UQ, but also had come from a history of engagement and partnership building with some folk over in Canada who have been working on the Canada map that does kind of similar things. And that was a big inspiration for our project. I also want to acknowledge the co-authors to the report, Juliana De Fiore and Joanna Horton, who also assisted. So this work is focused on civil society organisations, so include not-for-profit social enterprises, community welfare initiatives and advocacy coalitions, and recognises that really these are key actors driving local sustainability transformations across multiple interconnected systems. They contribute significantly to addressing complex social, economic and environmental issues such as poverty, housing stress, food insecurity, health inequity and climate resilience. And CSOs are also a vital lever for achieving transformative SDG governance and for defining pathways to progress human wellbeing, ecological sustainability and social justice more broadly. We also know that many CSOs seek to advance human rights-based approaches, and therefore they help to address key gaps in Australia's implementation of the 2030 agenda to date. But currently, we recognise that there was no comprehensive data infrastructure capturing the scope, scale and impact of CSO engagement with the United Nations SDGs at state or national level. So to address this gap, this report and this research mapped Queensland's civil society SDG ecosystem. We use the 2023 Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission data and an AI-assisted analysis of over 5,000 charities to create a detailed snapshot of CSO activity aligned with the SDGs. So this report, as you'll hear today, confirms that CSOs are important stakeholders whose work is directly relevant to progressing the SDGs in Queensland, contributing to human rights through an emphasis on reducing inequalities across social, economic and environmental spheres, which also aligns with the transformative goals of the SDG agenda. The study also demonstrates how better digital tools and data coordination can strengthen government CSO partnerships and support inclusive rights-based policy aligned with the 2030 agenda. So this report and its findings is the first for Australia, advancing research and action at the intersection of digital mapping, sustainability reporting and human rights. All right, so very briefly, a little bit of background, as I said, we started from the position of civil society being mandated to play a key role in partnership with government as an implementation of the 2030 agenda and SDGs. However, in a context of progress being set back by COVID and government inaction in Australia, there was really a big gap in understanding the scope and scale of integrated action by CSOs around achieving the SDGs. The quality national level data on CSO networks and actions was lacking, and this has consequences for advancing a human rights-based approach to SDG localisation in Australia. So this report sought to fill that gap by providing new data on how and where CSO activities in Queensland are aligned with the SDGs and strengthens our understanding of how the SDGs are being translated and integrated into local contexts across Australia. We were inspired, as I said before, by the work in Canada provided by the SDG Data Map, and this is an online data sharing tool that links CSO activities across Canada directly to the SDG targets and indicators. And this has been really beneficial, provided really great outcomes for improving civic engagement with the 2030 agenda and supporting civil society organisations with capacity to inform government action. So this inspired us. No current data observatory like this exists for Australia. And so we saw this as a significant opportunity to build that social science research infrastructure using digital mapping to improve the understanding of CSO pathways to achieving and implementing SDGs. So in this report, we really focused on shifting to better understand how the SDGs are relevant to CSOs. So not just looking at how are the SDGs being implemented, but where is the relevance aligned with CSOs' agendas themselves, to point to opportunities for bringing a stronger human rights focus into domestic SDG implementation here in Australia. Right, very briefly, and you can read more about the methodology in depth online, but we use the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission data as a starting point for identifying CSOs in Australia. And then we used the subset of charities that were classified as promoting or protecting human rights to narrow down and zoom in on how CSOs might be addressing human rights aligned with SDGs. We worked with a team in Germany called the SDG Global Goals Directory, who applied their AI-assisted methodology to then map out how CSOs align with SDGs using publicly available online data from their websites. So you can see here, there was lots of data that was scanned, over 500,000 web pages scanned, finding 34,000 plus websites with an SDG focus. And they also use a keyword search to deepen that analysis. So our report used this methodology to ask 3 questions. What is the scale and scope of CSO efforts towards achieving intersection SDGs in Queensland? How do those CSOs address the SDGs through a human rights lens? And then what are the benefits of mapping these interconnections for the social services sector? So for the remainder of, this one I was going to say, what can we actually map? I won't go into this in too much detail. You can read about it in the report. But what we did is by using the ACNC data, we could then have a look at, well, what categories of work do CSOs align themselves with? And you can see over here on the right that CSOs could align themselves with advancing education, social and public welfare, health, natural environment, and human rights. So we use these categories also to refine our analysis. We also use data visualization. We test piloted an online map, which unfortunately I can't share with you today because it's not publicly available. But this map was for us to see, well, how might this work to visualize this data? And in future, we would love this map to be made publicly available and for CSOs to actually be able to self-edit the information stored in that map to make that really more active. We also found that of our overall subset of CSOs that are using the SDGs in their websites, 49 of those are in the category of promoting or protecting human rights aligned with the ACNC. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of one of the limitations, I think, of the study. All right. So in the brief time I've got, what I'd like to do is just run through some of the key findings from the report with you. And the first one here is to look at the overview of the SDG CSO ecosystem overall. And so in our analysis, we identified 2,583 CSOs that used at least one SDG in their work. And this represents about 30% of the CSOs registered in Queensland. Out of that overall data sample, however, only 6% actually mentioned the SDGs explicitly on their web pages. So that tells us something about how the SDGs are being used within the sector to communicate their work. But despite that, we found that CSOs work across all of the SDGs, as you can see here. CSOs in Queensland are working mostly amongst SDG 3, good health and wellbeing, followed by SDG 4, education, SDG 10, reduced inequalities, SDG 5, gender equity, and SDG 15, life on land. However, we found the least commonly addressed goals to be many of the, interestingly, environmental goals, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. The least commonly addressed goals are SDG 7, clean energy, SDG 6, water and sanitation, SDG 17, partnerships for the goals, and SDG 13, climate action. So in general, environmental goals receive less attention than social and economic goals do. We can unpack this a little bit more. So here you can see on the right when we unpack each SDG against its pillar, we found that 81% of Queensland CSOs are aligning with economic SDGs, and this outweighs those who align with social or environmental SDGs in the analysis. So with fewer CSOs working in the environmental space, we therefore see that environmental goals are being the least actioned by CSOs in Queensland. And where they are being addressed, this tends to be by CSOs who self-identify with the category of protecting the natural environment. While this is quite logical, it also reveals that environmental issues tend to remain quite siloed from the social and economic issues. This brought us then to have a little bit closer of analysis or a think about the intersections between SDGs and the trade-offs that might be happening. So we know that with multiple conflicts and crises, these create major setbacks for inequality, poverty eradication, climate action, gender equality, education, eliminating hunger. And so an integrated approach is really central to progressing the SDGs. So in this analysis, understanding those intersections or inconsistencies and trade-offs between SDGs is a gap that this work can help to address. So here, one of the findings, for example, was that SDG Climate 13, climate action, is being addressed by 45 environmental CSOs, or 23%, compared to only 4% of the social and economic CSOs. So that work in climate action space is primarily environmental, with fewer connections to CSOs who identify with social welfare priorities. And this, while it suggests something about how they're working, it might also just be around how CSOs are communicating their SDG action regarding climate change in an integrated way. Conversely, though, we've found significant evidence that human health and well-being are closely tied, or we know, in the literature, that human health and well-being are closely tied to healthy natural environments, and that gender equality is a key factor influencing environmental protection. But this weak link between environmental CSOs and either SDG 3, good health and well-being, is a limitation here. It's interesting that one exception to that could be seen in the ecosystem for SDG 2 on zero hunger, where we see that those CSOs working on SDG 2 seem to be more balanced across environmental, social, and economic CSOs. And this is a really interesting finding, considering that SDG Zero Hunger also is one of these intersecting goals that crosses across all of the SDGs. Another, I guess, here a finding is that's quite a contrast to that, again, is around SDG 1 on no poverty, where we found relatively few CSOs being aligned in the social category in the ACNC data, and even fewer in the environmental ACNC category. So here, although alleviating poverty has been described as a foundational goal by which other goals can be achieved, it can also be achieved indirectly by reducing inequality and improving health, education, and peace building. So in that sense, we might have expected to see greater intersections or crossovers between SDGs in these different social, environmental, and economic spaces for SDG 1, but which we didn't really find. The next key element that we would point out in our study is that we can map the place-based CSOs by location geographically in our research. And this is a major contribution of the research that hasn't been done before. And this capacity was embedded in the online pilot platform that we created for the project. Here you can see this figure presents an overall SDG CSO ecosystem for Queensland. And with most of the Queensland population concentrated in the southeast corner, it's not surprising that SDG CSO work might be concentrated in metropolitan Brisbane, Gold Coast, and Sunshine Coast, followed by regional centres such as Bundaberg, Rockhampton, Mackay, Townsville, and Cairns. But we can also look at the map to show where the SDGs and which SDGs are the focus of work in remote and very remote communities, such as Mount Isa, Cape Town, Charleville, and Weipa. In the online map that we piloted, we built in the capacity to filter or zoom in for detailed information about the SDG ecosystem in specific locations. And then it's possible to investigate strengths and gaps in that integrated sustainability action. For example, you could zoom in on Mount Isa, which I've given you just a snapshot here on the screen, where you could zoom in and look at, well, what are the actual CSOs active in this area and which SDGs is their work aligned to. And this information could help CSOs in those places to work out who they can be connecting with, who they can be working with, as well as where their work might overlap with other CSOs in other geographical regions. This kind of data also has a great potential to compare with other geographical data sets, such as the ABS Statistical Index of Relative Socioeconomic Advantage or Disadvantage, or other census data. It also helps us to think about complex sustainability issues. For example, health equity is a really good example there. This is one indicator of inequality that our data can map geographically. So if we ask the question, how does the SDG CSO ecosystem for good health and well-being reflect action on health equity? Who is doing the work and where are they located? We can look at the SDG ecosystem and then compare this or use the ACNC data to look at, well, where is that work occurring? Where are they located? And we know that health equity or health outcomes are disproportionately worse in rural and remote areas, where 66% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples live in Queensland, for example. We also know that 7 out of 10 of Australia's most disadvantaged local government areas are in Queensland, with implications there for lower life expectancy in remote areas, and again for Indigenous people, barriers to accessing healthcare in rural and remote areas, etc. So here on the right, we looked at our data and asked, well, for these CSOs working on health, where are they located? They're finding that about 30%, 36% of CSOs working on health and wellbeing, SDG 3, are located in those rural, regional, remote or Indigenous communities. And this can help to tell us some really interesting or further information unpacking who is doing this work in those regional areas. So the next key finding here was about SDG 10 and reducing inequalities. In terms of SDG progress in Australia, SDG 10 is the worst performing goal, according to other studies. However, we found that reducing inequalities is core to the work of the social service sector, as evidenced by the really high proportion of CSOs whose activities align with SDG 10 in Queensland. So within just the human rights sample that we looked at, 2 out of 3 CSOs are aligned with SDG 10 in that sample. Here on the right, you can also then look at, well, where that work targets inequalities, who are the stakeholders being mostly looked at? We can see that a high proportion of CSOs are targeting reducing inequalities for children, females and families, suggesting a strong gender dimension in CSO work and inequality. However, CSOs are least frequently targeting migrants, refugees and people seeking asylum, and the LGBTIQ+ community, indicating areas needing greater investment in that space. We also took a look at SDG 17 partnerships for the goals, largely because a core driver of the research was to understand how are CSOs involved in SDG work. And although CSOs commonly work in allies and in collaboration with each other, only 6% of the CSOs in our sample were using the SDG 17 partnerships for the goals to communicate this aspect of their work on their websites. CSOs aligned with SDG 17 mostly also work on SDG 3, good health and wellbeing, SDG 4, quality education, and SDG 10 on reduced inequalities, mirroring the overall data set. So this finding really suggests that there are opportunities for CSOs to use SDG language more explicitly to communicate and drive that great partnership work that they're doing. We also took a look at who might be the different types of CSOs doing this work, and we found that small and large CSOs present quite a similar level of engagement with SDG 17. This suggests, though, that smaller CSOs might find the SDG framework more beneficial for the purpose of communicating partnerships than those larger CSOs do. Alternatively, it may signal specific challenges faced by small CSOs around gaining visibility for their work in general, and thus attracting partnerships. We think that some further research to investigate how different size CSOs perceive the benefits of using the SDGs to communicate or attract partnerships would be really beneficial. All right, finally, I'll show a couple of findings from the human rights dataset in the analysis. We know that integration of human rights with SDG implementation is occurring, but increased attention is crucial for improving progress. So of the 49 CSOs in Queensland who formally align their activities with human rights, most are working in the areas of SDG 10, reduced inequalities, SDG 3, good health and wellbeing, and SDG 5 in gender equality. One unexpected finding here, at least for me, my work is very closely aligned with SDG 2, zero hunger. So I was quite surprised to find that so few CSOs in this data set, this subset of the data appeared to, in the SDGs categorized as key human rights issues such as zero hunger, SDG 2, but also around SDG 1, no poverty. So we know that both of those SDGs, for example, SDG 02 being aligned with the human right for food and nutrition, and SDG 1, no poverty, being aligned with various human rights instruments. So this report really builds on that broader literature around that intersection between CSO work, certain SDGs and human rights instruments to suggest that this analysis can be really useful for understanding those interconnected sustainability challenges of human rights. Within this human rights subset, then we look to ask, well, who is being targeted, or where does this work focus? We found here that human rights work is mostly directed towards youth, people with disabilities and gender issues, as well as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Just like in the overall sample, however, migrants and refugees, LGBTIQ+ people are the least addressed demographic for the human rights CSOs, with the addition of victims of disasters and veterans. So those are just a few in brief sort of snapshots of some of the key findings of the report. But now in concluding, I'd like to turn about what do I think are some of the implications of this work for thinking more broadly around mapping CSO movement towards SDG implementation in Australia. Mapping the CSO SDG ecosystem provides a really crucial concurrent evidence base for strengthening human rights-based approaches to SDG implementation in Australia and accelerating localisation of sustainable development efforts. This work recognises CSOs as vital SDG actors and really focusing then on messaging to government that at all levels, recognising CSOs as vital actors really will improve support, financing and inclusion of CSOs in debating, measuring and implementing the SDG agenda domestically. Mapping the SDG ecosystem provides this crucial evidence for strengthening rights-based approaches to implementation. And CSOs can use this kind of approach to identify gaps in action around their integrated SDG work and identify, track and prioritise their human rights-related work. We found that over 2,500 CSOs are already contributing to SDGs, yet very few explicitly refer to the SDGs in their public communications. So this is a great opportunity for CSOs to increase engagement with the SDG framework, using it to better articulate, attract support, and connect local action with that global agenda. And finally, Australia-wide implementation of this Queensland level pilot would really help to expand the potential for this more comprehensive public engagement with the SDGs. We really would be really keen to see this work being replicated for the rest of Australia as a crucial step towards leaving no one behind. Some specific opportunities for civil society organisations, and I'll be quite quick here before I pass over to Kiah to comment. But considering how the sector is engaged in SDGs is really useful for CSOs themselves. They can use the SDG framework to better articulate impact, as I said before, also to help track and prioritise their human rights work. And using an online map as such as the one that we have developed in this project can really help to reveal those gaps and synergies. So how CSO work might be integrated into this kind of an online mapping tool to build stronger cross-sectoral links and deepen sustainability outcomes is a great opportunity. For governments, scaling up an SDG movement map would be a crucial step towards improving engagement between civil society and government on SDG implementation. This requires governments to recognise those CSOs as vital actors and enhance participation in planning, financing and evaluating local efforts. Investing in the kind of data system that we've developed in this project can allow for that local, spatial and disaggregated data collection, ensuring that no communities are left behind in that digital policy making space. And an online digital map mapping CSO SDG ecosystem across Australia would provide a really unique and important information sharing platform to connect local governments, researchers, CSOs to enable that exchange of insights and co-design actions. All right, so that brings me to the end of the few findings that I want to talk about that you can read more about in the report. I'd like now to turn over to our two discussants from QCOS, Charlotte Beaumont-Field, the Sector Development Officer of Human Rights, and Stacey DeKama, Executive Director, Sector Workforce Planning and Development. So I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand over to Charlotte and Stacey to just provide some of your reflections or insights on the key messages, but also how you see this benefiting or supporting the work that QCOS does across Queensland.
Thanks very much. Charlotte, would you like me to kick us off and then I'll pass over to you?
Yeah, sure, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, and hello to everyone who's online. I'm Stacey, and I've worked at QCOS for 8 years now in sector development work, and so capability across the sector in being able to articulate their work, particularly the impact of their work, is something that our team is considering all of the time, really. And there was a few things that have come up for us when we were having a look at this report and looking at the findings. And one that was really prominent to me is the funding environment and the political environment in which community organisations are operating. So we represent funded community organisations, generally those who have funding that they've received from Queensland government. And I'm really mindful when I'm looking at this type of work, how responsive and how much organisations are shaped by the funding opportunities that are available to them. So we will often see out of just the need to remain sustainable as an organisation, to keep doors open, to remain operating, that organisations do have to bend and morph to the political environment in which they operate and the funding that's available to them. And obviously just recently we have had a change in government. That's a great reminder to us in the ways that organisations do morph to the environment in which they're operating. So that was one thing that I was thinking of when you were speaking about the ways that organisations frame their work and name their work and talk about the impact that they're having. There's always a direct correlation to what resourcing is available to us. And so how do we have to talk about our work to be able to maintain that resourcing? And another thing that you brought up was data systems and the way that organisations report on their impact. And there's certainly capability that can be, there's some brilliant impact reporting happening across the community services sector, but certainly opportunity for us as a community sector to increase our capability in the way that we report. And there is a lot of benefit to aligning the way that we talk about impact. So certainly some considerations there, and you've made some recommendations around how government could actually enable that work, which I think is good. Another one that I picked up on was just the comment around food or hunger. And in Queensland, we really have some maturity to develop, I think, in the way that we think about human rights, which is fair. You know, the Human Rights Act in Queensland is fairly young, and our maturity is still developing in the way that we understand it and how it underpins the way we think about social services. So in our State of the Sector report last year, and some of you may not be familiar with, we're about to release our 2025 report actually. But in our State of the Sector report from 2024, and that is built on our regional consultation. We do regional town halls every year. So that consultation data plus our statewide survey data, we produce this State of the Sector report for the community services sector. And in the report last year, only 4% said that food support was part of their core delivery as an organisation. And generally that's framed up as an emergency relief. So in Queensland, we do have this emergency relief culture because of where we live and the emergencies and the natural disasters that do occur here. So my link that I'm making here around maturity, about thinking about human rights, is that we in Queensland are still thinking about food and hunger as like vouchers when there's been a disaster, rather than more in a human rights lens. And so I think that's interesting to pick up on, is just the way that we're viewing these things as emergencies rather than something that needs a far more strategic way of addressing it. Yeah. I think Charlotte might have some thoughts about human rights, if you would like to share, Charlotte.
Thank you, Stacey. Just on the food issue as well, I think in my experience, a lot of community services do provide food, but maybe it's not highlighted as a sort of a main goal. It's just a natural sort of part of providing that service is also the provision of food, and that may not be communicated as well. Hello, everybody. I am Charlotte Fremont-Field. My background is about 20 years working predominantly in sector in delivery of service. So working with a lot of young people, working in homeless shelters and things like this. And human rights is very important to me, and I have seen such a shift in that 20, 25 years, whatever it's been, in how the Human Rights Act, well, now the Human Rights Act is, fairly new in Queensland, but how human rights more broadly were featured in the service delivery. So we may not have spoken explicitly of human rights, but we may have used terms like trauma-informed or person-centred or culturally safe. So there's a lot of terms out there that organisations are using, and there are a lot of practices that are happening in Queensland that are human rights respecting, that maybe are not acknowledged by the services themselves, because what we are seeing here at QCOS is such a huge movement towards acting with a human rights lens, especially around decision making. I've seen that a lot, using that human rights framework and the Human Rights Act in Queensland before making decisions, and that's what I've seen as a huge change. But I do agree that I guess some of the, coming together on some of the language would be more useful in terms of having a look at what other organisations are doing. I do want to mention specifically, as an example of organisations really moving forward in terms of human rights respecting practice, is the Caxton Legal Centre and the Queensland Advocacy for Inclusion. Those two services have opted into the Queensland Human Rights Act. So now that they are opting into the obligations under that Act, which is a clear sign of the change in Queensland, a really visible shift, and the growing movement that we're seeing that are clearly pushing towards that human rights respecting practice. I also believe in the collaboration between services and understanding what a lot of other services in particular areas are doing, and helping each other to grow in that provision as well. I think that's very important. Overall, I guess that the language we use and is important, and the recognition of the work that community services are doing already, and maybe that needs to be reframed, or maybe there's more understanding needed in the fantastic work they're already doing is actually human rights respecting and actually do correspond to the social development goals, sustainable development goals, sorry. Yes, I'm just looking at my notes. Stacey, do you want to talk about the different networks that we offer?
Yeah,
or?
thanks, Charlotte. I'll very quickly, we just have a couple of little slides to share here with you all, because we do have a few avenues that we can use to support organisations to develop these capabilities, not only human rights respecting practice, but also the way that they actually articulate their impact as organisations, which fits really nicely with what's been discussed today and the findings of this particular research. So I wanted to mention that recently we have done some work to develop an excellence framework, and these are the 7 areas that the community services sector had prioritised for capability development. So we undertook a literature review and a significant amount of consultation with the sector, and our research question really was, what are the common characteristics or capabilities of organisations who are able to deliver excellence, where excellence is defined as being able to meet their mission or purpose. So these were the 7 common areas that came up for organisations. This is what they very clearly communicated to us was needed for them to be able to deliver excellence as services. And we do have a full excellence framework on the QCOS website if you're interested in having a look at that, which actually talks about all the indicators that sit underneath each of those areas. So it won't surprise you that this is the way that we frame up our sector development work at QCOS. We deliver things that are aligned with these areas of excellence. The ones that we wanted to mention to you today were the human rights respecting area of excellence and also the evidence-based practice one, because we do see this as real vital enablers of the sustainable development goals. It's really useful to have that shared language for talking about our work as a sector and the impact that we have as a sector. Of course, many of the different sustainable development goals are touched on through these, but we'll just focus on those 2 today. So the Research and Evaluation Network is convened regularly through the year. I think most months actually they're meeting. It's an opportunity for collaboration and knowledge sharing in the area of research and evaluation, with the aim of utilising community service resources more effectively to improve outcomes for organisations and their clients. They're free. You can register for them through the QCOS events page, and we also have on Community Door a whole resource hub where you can find all the recordings that network has produced over the years. We also have our Human Rights Network, which is convened quarterly. It's for those working in the community services sector who want to deepen their capacity to understand and apply human rights to their work. They explore a whole range of human rights related topics, and Charlotte, perhaps you could put the link for the next one in the chat, because we do have a network, the last one for the year, coming up really soon actually. Yeah. And that's around trauma-informed practice. So again, you can register via the QCOS events page, and that network gets together regularly to talk about the way that they actually implement human rights into their work, and a lot of that is also around the way that we talk about it. So, we talk about person-centered, we talk about human rights focus. So there's different ways that people are actually speaking about their work, and often we're talking about a fairly similar thing but use some different languages. So that really jumped out to us in this the research that you've done. So our summary today, before we hand back over, is that community organisations make a huge contribution to the recognition and respect of human rights in Queensland, and I think it's really important to say that human rights respecting practice and evidence-based practice and collaboration are all really high on the agenda for community services sector. And this is good news if we want to refine the way that we articulate and measure our work. So it's good to know that most service providers are really on the same page with this. They want to be able to do this work well. It's really useful for us to have shared ways of articulating and reporting impact. And also that the SDG 8, so decent work and economic growth, is a growing area of interest of the community services sector. So I particularly the way that we talk about the impact that we have as a workforce and as a sector. Also, as a highly feminised workforce, if we're talking about the workforce itself, a lot more conversation been happening in the last couple of years about gender under evaluation and procurement practices in the not-for-profit space, and the way that those things, either the SHADS award or procurement practices in Queensland, have really actually shaped the way this sector has done its work, and that there are different ways that we could be doing things in the not-for-profit space.
I'd also like to add the importance of having like an Australia-wide or a Queensland-wide at the moment sort of a framework of talking about these kind of issues in the SDGs also lends itself for further argument for a national human rights act. So having that framework that we're all Australians are collaborating, they're all clear on the language that they're using and the goals that they're working towards. So I think, a lot of the goals of the findings of this report and what QCOS are seeing is that people are wanting the same thing, but there's maybe a few different barriers, and some of the language needs solidifying. And I guess just to re-emphasise that the community sector as a whole doing fantastic work that and maybe not giving themselves enough credit or not realising maybe that they are strongly aligned with human rights values and practice. So maybe some more recognition of their work and translating that into human rights work and showing the link of what they're doing is actually human rights respecting practice. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Charlotte and Stacey, for responding in the way that you have, and also highlighting the resources that QCOS has available. And just in the chat, just for everyone's benefit, Stacey and Charlotte have put some of those, and Kiah Smith has, in the Centre for Policy Futures, also put Kiah's report. So please do click and follow those links through. So that's been a really good conversation, and particularly appreciate the way in which we're thinking about human rights in the Queensland context, and that evolution from charity to needs-based to human rights, and to acknowledge, as Stacey and Charlotte have, that it's uneven in some areas, and food is one of those. There's obviously other kinds of norms that play into that, but obviously, as Stacey and Charlotte have emphasised, the rights-based approach does advance the way in which we speak about these issues, recognise them as real issues in the community, inequality as well, but also can help to overcome some of the stigma that's associated with a more charitable-based response to issues like food security, for example, which is core to Kiah's work in the right to food. We'd have about 10 minutes, or anyone has any comments or questions that they'd like to ask, either really of Kiah, Stacey or Charlotte, or any comments to make, just pop your hand up. You can turn your camera on and come off mic if you want to ask live. That's probably the easiest way to do it. But if not, you can pop it in the chat. So do we have anyone like to make a comment or a question? Brian, I can see your hands up. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. And my apologies, first of all, because unfortunately, because of another commitment, I missed the start of the presentation. So I'm jumping in halfway through. So my apologies if this has been covered. Just a little bit of a background. I'm the Director of Policy Engagement at Safe Food Production Queensland. So we're a regulatory agency that is a statutory body. So we stand alone. We don't represent the Queensland Government, although we're a Queensland Government agency. We have a new regulatory delivery framework that we're implementing. We're aiming to have a best practice model that we implement for how we regulate. And we regulate in the primary production and processing areas of food. So farming, production, basically through to like cheese making and so forth, but we don't deal with the retail end. But having said that, the food system is an extremely complex and diverse system that has a whole range of different benefits, and also really works much better with good collaboration right across everyone that's involved. So you can achieve both the environmental, the social and the economic goals that the government is aiming for. I think one of the challenges we find in this space is obviously trying to make sure that when we're looking at food security comes up more and more in discussions with us. Now, we don't regulate food security, we purely regulate food safety, but we have a good knowledge of the system. And we do recognise that unless you have food safety and have a good, safe, secure supply chain, you will not get food security. And particularly in our rural and remote regions, to actually achieve food security and have a healthy, sustainable food supply 24/7 is ideally what we'd like to achieve, but is a real triumph if we actually manage to achieve that. I guess my question here with all that background information is, what are the mechanisms that are there? What are the mechanisms that need to be developed to bring different sectors and different areas of government and different areas when we're looking at the areas that we're working in here together as one to discuss how we're all contributing to achieve the overall impacts that we desire, because no one can achieve them on themselves. We all have lots of different information, lots of different data that can actually help to point and prioritize where resources need to go and where both collectively, both the non-government and government and community sectors need to kind of work together. Is there a mechanism to bring that together and discuss that and not only map out kind of the ecosystem, but map out a way that joins all the dots? Coming from very much from an approach of that regulation itself has a main driver and objective, but if regulation is done well, it supports a lot more than what the regulation was set up to do. And for us, for example, we have a lot of knowledge and experience in all of our primary production sectors right across the state. So I'm just trying to get an idea of, this is a great discussion. Quite frankly, it's the first time I've had this kind of discussion here within Queensland, to my knowledge. I'm pleased to have this discussion, but I guess I'm trying to get a better idea as, and food security keeps coming up as part of this. So what are the mechanisms to work together to try to get those kind of changes, to get those collaboration, to improve productivity across everyone that's involved, so we're not duplicating, we're working together, and we can use each other's information to actually find out whether we're achieving our overall goals.
Thanks,
That's
Brian.
very long-winded, so apologies.
Yeah, we haven't got. Thanks, Brian, for the question and the background. Kiah got a response, and maybe Stacey or Charlotte might have something to say too. Kiah?
Yeah, sure. So look, Brian, there was lots in there that I could unpack, and we could talk about that for days. I guess a couple of things to say. So one, simply in the right to food and the food security space, I think that there's a big gap in Australia in addressing food security through a right to foods lens. And we know that, and we see that in how food is governed. Food is governed across 11 different federal agencies at the federal level in Australia, and that's just at the national level, let alone how food is being governed. The food system is governed at state and local. So for me, this is a big question about how food is governed. And then I guess in answering your question, I'll answer it a little bit through the lens of what this report sought to do. And food was only one element of SDGs, but because food is one of these, SDG 2 connects with every single SDG, it's a really good lens to ask questions about how do we see the intersections between those, and what role does human rights actually maybe play in strengthening those interconnections. So in this report, what we're really seeking to do is to say, well, civil society needs to be at the table when it comes to talking about how inequality is being governed. So really fundamentally, from my perspective and lots of perspectives, probably, I think, a driver of food insecurity, when we look at that through a social lens and look at social inequality as being a key driver, one of the key ways to then address that is to take an intersectional approach to thinking about how do inequalities connect and influence that space. So in this work, what we've sought to do is look across those different intersecting areas and ask, well, how are civil society organisations already contributing to doing this work on the ground? We're not necessarily saying that we need to reinvent solutions, but as a mechanism, and certainly the mapping that we want, that we think, if this was expanded nationally to map what are the activities that CSOs are doing that with a direct contribution to SDGs, this would be a huge resource to be able to look at those intersections across social, economic, environmental inequalities across the country. And human rights, obviously, is a component of that work. I will just point out that the methodology around human rights, because the SDGs, there's no one SDG that says it's a human rights SDG. So you have to look across each of the SDGs for where they connect, but also the ways that CSOs themselves identify as doing human rights work. And so our database and our analysis use keywords to do that. So I think this is a tool that, for example, could apply to CSOs in the food sector to look at, well, what other organisations are working on the kinds of social, economic, environmental inequalities that relate to addressing food security in my space, in my sector? Is it about decent work? Is it about climate action? Is it about land and water? And to connect then the civil society organisations themselves to strengthen them as a voice in that type of collaborative governance that you're alluding to. So I think that's a real strength of why map across a CSO SDG ecosystem across all of these different human rights related areas.
Now, Charlotte or Stacey, if you did want to respond, you've got about a minute on this question Brian had about.
I think that's been addressed well, unless you have something, Charlotte.
No, great. So the coordination piece is critical, as Brian said, and some of the resources that Stacey and Charlotte have mentioned around bringing sectors together with government and private sector is needed, obviously, in the mixed economy that we have in Queensland, particularly around the food system. But to really make a rights-based approach core to that, I think is, that's the important piece that needs to happen in shifting how we frame these issues. And that's important generally in Australian society, where we tend to have the kind of egalitarian myth where we don't think that we have as much hunger or poverty as we actually do. And I think that that's also part of the challenge in cutting through. Thanks very much, Kiah and Stacey and Charlotte, for connecting the local and the global. And there's obviously more work to do here about how to use these kind of mapping exercises as tools for organisations and the next steps in terms of action across all sectors. So thanks again to our guests, Stacey and Charlotte, for making time today from QCOS. Really great to hear about the work that's happening there. And to Kiah and to co-authors, of course, for the work they did in all of that data analysis that we heard about today, making those key findings and recommendations. And thanks to Kiah Smith, who's always organising our In Conversation webinars for the Centre. So do stay tuned for the next one. Join our mailing list, check the website. We'll have details about the next one soon. But I think that's it from us and everyone else. Thanks again for making the time today, for joining the webinar, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. So, and have a good afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
guys. Thanks.
Thanks very much, everyone.